So, along with the technological revolution and the industrial revolution came the capitalist revolution. And there's lots of different flavors of capitalism around the world and throughout history. So, we're going to focus on what we think the basics of any capitalist system is. And it's basically going to come down to the institutions. And so, we're going to use this term a lot this semester. And the institutions are both the laws that govern a society and also the social customs and how they relate to the production and distribution of goods and services, right? And so we'll talk about some of them more. Um, Capitalism is one in which the institutions focus on private property, on markets, and on firms. And really, what happened sort of from the previous 1,000 years to the current time, starting around the 17th century, was that while we had more or less an economic system of private property, it was a family-based production. People mostly farmed for themselves, or they farmed for the landlord and were able to, keep some fraction of that for themselves. Then we introduced a market economy, right? So things are getting bought and sold more. And then the addition of firms really provided the incentive to take some of this uh, new technology and develop new products, new processes, and earn a profit where that might not have been possible before. So if we think about private property, this is one of the most important pieces of capitalism, and it's basically just means that, hey, we have some ownership rights. We get to decide what we're going to do with whatever property we're talking about, right? So it includes things like your books, your TV, your house, but it also includes things like capital goods, right? So capital goods are something that workers will use in order to produce more stuff, right? So think about a computer, that's a capital good. But so is a rake, right? So is, a hoe used on a farm. So is a tractor. So is a truck. All of these are capital goods. A lot of things are not defined, right? So air is not private property. A lot of water is not private property. Knowledge is often not private property, right? So we'll talk about, intellectual property and things like that. But knowledge is something that can be shared. If I use it and you use it at the same time, that's fine, right? It doesn't. If I use it, it doesn't mean you can't use it. So with markets, what we're talking about is a way for people to exchange products and services, and it's voluntary, right? So I don't come along with a gun and say, "Hey, you give me that, and I'll give you $5." It's, "Hey, I'll give you $5 if you give me that." And you say, "No, I'll give me $7. I'll give you that." Okay, then we'll do that, right? As long as it's mutually beneficial, then that's what we're talking about as a market, right? So they're voluntary, and usually there's competition. And what we'll see is that competition is extremely important for markets to work effectively, right? It provides the incentives to innovate, it keeps prices down, and it makes capitalism work much, much better. Now, firms are an organization, right, that takes inputs. Inputs are things like labor, but it's also things like if you're making clothes, it will include the cloth. If you're making breakfast cereal, it will include the corn or the wheat or the oats, um, and turns them in to products and goods and services, right? So the inputs and outputs are both private property. The firm uses markets to sell the outputs, and usually what they're trying to do is make money, right? They're trying to sell their output for more than they bought their input, right? And that's the profit. And the owners get to keep the profit. And that's what provides incentives to come up with new products and services or new ways to make the old products and services more cheaply. And firms are a legal fiction, right? They are not people, but people work in firms. But firms can be born, they can grow, they can shrink, and they can die uh, very quickly, right? So some firms have been around for a long time. Other firms are quite new. Some firms have long since died. And so that is actually another benefit of capitalism and one of the things that we'll talk about later on. So if we think about the capitalist revolution, then capitalism, we're arguing, really led to the growth in living standards because they were able to take this new technology and use it to develop these new products and services and specialize in a way that historically was not possible, right? So now we have firms that are specializing in creating uh, textiles, that are specializing in creating trains, that are specializing in creating, different types of food. And so along with the technological revolution, it was really the capitalist revolution that provided the incentives for firms to do this. That is what increased worker productivity. And worker productivity is just how much can a worker produce in an hour or a day or a year. And without increased worker productivity, we don't get that increase in GDP per capita. We don't get that increase in disposable income. And so those two things combined are really what led to that hockey stick growth. So if we think about specialization, we're going to do a little quick example here. But the idea is that if people can specialize, then they can produce one thing rather than lots of things, and then trade that one thing for all the other things they need. Usually they sell that one thing for money and then take that money and buy all the other things they need, right? So specialization can help people because they learn by doing, right? We have all had the experience so that when we do things more, we get better and better at it. It can take advantages of natural differences in skill. So that could be true on an individual level, on a firm level, on a country level. And it can take advantages of economies of scale. So often as firms get bigger, they're able to reduce their costs, and that can increase their profits, but also decrease prices for people. Um, and in a capitalist society, if people and firms can specialize and then trade via markets, then everybody can be better off. And so we can see this. So here's just a quick example from the textbook where if we have two people, Greta and Carlos, that can produce either apples or wheat. And Greta can produce either 1,250 apples, or if she spends all her time producing wheat, she can produce 50 tons of wheat. Carlos, on the other hand, could produce 1,000 apples or 20 tons of wheat, or they could produce some combination of the two if they split their time. So we're going to use two different terms here that are important. One is absolute advantage. Who can produce more? Well, Greta can produce more apples and more wheat, so she has the absolute advantage in both. Just like the United States probably has the absolute advantage over a lot of countries in producing things just because we're bigger. We have the largest economy. However, Carlos has a comparative advantage in apples, meaning he has to give up less wheat than does Greta. So he is least disadvantaged in the production of apples. So as we're going to see, if he specializes in producing apples and Greta specializes in producing wheat, they can actually both then trade and consume more than they could before. So here's an example. If they don't trade, then Greta produces 500 apples and 30 bushels of wheat, and Carlos produces 300 apples and 14 bushels of wheat, for a total of 800 apples and 44 bushels of wheat. But if they do specialize, then as we said, Carlos specializes in apples. He produces 1,000 apples. Greta specializes in wheat, produces 50 bushels of wheat, and then they trade. In this case, they trade 15 bushels of wheat for 600 apples. So those 600 apples go up to Greta. She gets 600 apples. And the 15 bushels of wheat go to Carlos. He gets 15 bushels of wheat. And now we can see that both Greta and Carlos are consuming more apples and wheat than they were when they were just producing by themselves. And that's because they specialized in what they had the comparative advantage in. And in total, now we're producing 1,000 apples compared to 800 and 50 bushels of wheat compared to 44. And so we're producing more than we had been previously. And so the idea here is that there are gains to trade, right? If we produce and specialize in what we have the comparative advantage in and then trade, we can both be better off. One thing we should note is that there are lots of different trades that would have made them both better off. This is just one example. And which trade they actually do is going to depend on history, it's going to depend on who has more bargaining power, etc. So one of the pieces of one of the takeaways here is that specialization is important in a capitalist economy and allows us to consume more than we could otherwise, right? If we think about someone who had tried to specialize as an economics professor 1,000 years ago, it might not work so well because there might not be a big market, right? And so if I had to, you know, produce all my food, produce all my clothes, produce my transportation, produce my house, I'd be a lot poorer than I am right now. And so specialization allows us to consume more than we would if we just produced everything